So in this segment, Jacob Rees-Mogg claims Remainers are being obstructive in a bid to make it more difficult for Britain to benefit from Brexit. And of course, he spoke to none other than GB News, the UK's pinnacle in journalism and media, about all of these concerns. Because of course they questioned him and asked him the critical questions we're all thinking. Like, what was it like to grow up in the Victorian era? No, of course they didn't. So Mogg accused Remainers of deliberate objection and obstruction to make it more difficult for Britain to exploit the benefits of Brexit, even though we were told it'd be easy and simple and all of these things. Apparently those Remainers, those Remoaners, are causing all sorts of problems. So in an exclusive interview with GB News, the former Conservative Business Secretary accused the blob, slang for the civil service elite, of undermining ministers' attempts to remove EU laws from the UK statute book. He offers very little evidence of Brexit being blocked by the quote blob, the blob which is just a boring phrase like the establishment. Like, what Mogg and the Tories are asking ministers and civil servants to do is insane. They're asking them to look at about 4,000 bits of legislation and assess whether they should be kept, amended or scrapped. Each one would probably need some sort of impact assessment report, or at least a look at what would happen if the legislation was gone or amended. You can't do that by the end of this year. You're talking about reviewing around 333 bits of legislation each month without even factoring in holidays and even when Parliament is in recess. That's only if the reviews start now, literally the start of the year, but the legislation hasn't even passed yet and may not do so for months. It might not even pass this year. Mogg said, quote, "There is obstructivism. Remainers hate it because it is the key divergence from Europe that will make it much harder for a government with a very different policy to shadow Europe quietly once we got rid of retained EU law," end quote. And that's the key for Mogg and the Brexiteers. This isn't to help the country, but to make any future alignment with the EU more difficult. This will decimate trade with the EU as GB goods will face further checks on standards. This will decimate GB exports to the rest of the world too, given that the UK has high standards, and that helps with regards to standards checks for other countries. You know, the the EU CE mark is seen as one of the gold standards for goods. Let's also not forget that the TCA has a level playing field rules built in, so this could end the TCA, or at least the EU could put tariffs on us, which again kills trade. Mogg goes on to say, quote, "And that's why there's so much objection and obstruction from the blob and from the House of Lords, which has an overwhelming majority of Remainer peers," end quote. Sunak has vowed his government will review all laws imposed on the UK by Brussels when it is still part of the bloc by the end of this year. The laws were not imposed by Brussels. We played a key part in forming a lot of those rules whilst we were members, so this is nonsense. Some Tories are understood to have pushed for a delay to the deadline, arguing it is too soon, but Mogg rejected the criticism and claimed a law firm could complete the review in just a month. Who are this law firm? And if that's the case, the government should really hire them then. But I'm guessing he's talking more nonsense given that Mogg does not know a lot. He says, quote, "Well, as I understand, the government is pushing ahead with the retained EU law bill," he said, and I think this is tremendously important that you had an excellent interview recently with a very distinguished lawyer who said that he could do this by himself in a year and that a law firm could do it in a month. And I think that's right, end quote. So first he says he knows of a law firm. He claimed a law firm could do it, and now he's saying he's heard a law firm claim they could do it in. You know, what's he talking about? You know, and you know, I'm sure he could, and I'm sure this law firm could, just like I'm sure I could beat Usain Bolt in a race, you know, 100-meter dash. Sure. He says, quote, "I think the problem around it has been exaggerated, and all of these laws will have papers around them that would have required information when they were brought in. All of that is on file." And he says, that's his quote, end quote. "I think the problem has been exaggerated, and these laws will have papers around them." So you don't know if they have papers around them. You don't know where these papers are. Surely, as a business minister, you know, when you come up with these rules, right, surely you should have been like, okay, do these laws have a lot of papers around them? Do they have impact assessment reports, etc.? You didn't. You're speculating, pal. Like, that's the problem here. You were a minister, chief. Like, you should know better. If that's the case, that's good, because it means that the information around, if that's the case, I'm saying that's good, because it means that the information around any impacts the former EU laws have, we will know their impacts pretty quickly as long as the information is made public, which I doubt they will tell us. He called on the government, so Mogg called on the government to liberalise planning laws to get more houses built. He says, quote, "We have a socialist planning system based on a late 1940s Planning Act, which thinks that central government can predict and plan the amount of building that we need," he said. "And I've thought for some time that we need to move to a more market-based planning system. We need to free up the planning laws. And I think voters are ahead of the politicians in this. I think that they are ready for planning reform because they want their children and grandchildren to be able to buy properties, which they can't at the moment," end quote. So, first of all, what does planning rules have to do with the EU? Also, if he's right that our current rules are based around 1940s rules, the Tories have had decades to change this and haven't. Like, he's full of rubbish. Like, surely as a minister he could have pushed for this. I know that's not typically within his remit. It'd be, I think there's a housing minister, but surely you would push and lobby them to make reforms to house planning. Like, you think he'd be pushing for this for decades, given the fact that he's been around for that long. I just genuinely don't get the geezer. Like, yes, I don't know the specifics of it, but given the fact that there are a lot of not in my backyard voters, NIMBYs, who don't want new houses being built in their areas, because it would lower their house value, I'd be surprised if there were so many people who wanted more houses being built in their areas. Maybe in areas somewhere slightly further away. But point is, I don't know the specifics of planning rules. I'd have to look into it. But for him to suddenly say, "Oh, the housing's a big problem as well," like, that has nothing to do with the EU. Genuinely nothing to do with the EU. And for him to say these are socialist plans from the 1940s, like, Mudgy, like, you've had multiple Conservative governments since then. You even had Thatcher. Why would Thatcher allow these socialist housing policies to continue? It makes no sense. But anyways, I'm going to leave it there. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Support the channel on Patreon if you can. And hopefully I'll see you in the next one.